There are moments in life when heartbreak doesn't come from strangers. It comes from the people who taught you what love was supposed to look like. Imagine spending 12 years paying every mortgage bill to keep your parents from losing the only home they had, believing one day they would simply say, "Thank you." Now imagine sitting in a lawyer's office after burying both of them, only to hear that the house you helped save was left entirely to your younger brother, the one who never paid a single mortgage payment. It sounds impossible, but stories of family disputes over inheritances, unequal treatment among siblings, and children sacrificing everything for parents without receiving the same loyalty are sadly more common than many people realize. This story is inspired by those very real experiences that continue to divide families across America. Before we go deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. My name is Danielle Carter, and for most of my life I believed there was no sacrifice too great when it came to family. I grew up in a quiet neighborhood outside Charlotte, North Carolina, where everyone knew my parents as kind, hardworking people who would do anything for others. They were active in church, always the first to organize food drives, visit sick neighbors, or help someone through a difficult season. People admired them, and honestly, so did I. They taught me that family came before money, before comfort, and sometimes even before your own dreams. I never questioned those lessons because they seemed to come from a place of love. Looking back now, I realize there is a difference between helping the people you love and giving so much of yourself that they begin to believe you owe it to them. I just didn't know I would spend 12 years learning that lesson the hardest way possible. I was the oldest of 2 children, and from the time I was young, responsibility seemed to follow me everywhere. If something needed to be done, I was the one expected to do it. I watched my younger brother, Brandon, grow up under a completely different set of rules. If he forgot something, it was because he was young. If he made a mistake, he was still learning. If I made the same mistake, I should have known better because I was the older sister. At first, I convinced myself every family worked that way. Parents often lean on the oldest child a little more. That didn't seem unfair. What I didn't notice was that those small differences never disappeared. They only became bigger as we got older, and before long, they would shape the biggest betrayal of my life. After graduating from college, I found a steady job in healthcare administration. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid well enough for me to rent a small apartment, pay my bills on time, and slowly build a savings account. I remember feeling proud every time I watched that balance grow, because I had one dream that never changed. I wanted to buy a home of my own before I turned 40. I pictured family dinners around my own table, a backyard for summer cookouts, and a place that belonged to me because I had earned every brick of it. Brandon's life looked very different. He drifted from one job to another, always chasing the next opportunity, without staying anywhere long enough to build stability. Yet somehow, my parents never seemed worried about him. Whenever he needed help with rent, a car payment, or another fresh start, they found a way to make it happen. I noticed the pattern, but I kept telling myself it wasn't my place to judge how parents loved their son. Everything changed one rainy Thursday evening when my mother called me just after I finished work. I could hear fear in her voice before she even explained what had happened. Dad's business had slowed down, medical bills were piling up, and they had fallen behind on their mortgage. The bank had sent another notice, and they were terrified they might lose the house they had lived in for more than 30 years. My mother wasn't crying loudly. She barely whispered as she asked if I could come over because they needed to talk. The moment I walked through their front door and saw those unopened bills spread across the dining room table, my heart sank. My father looked exhausted, almost embarrassed, and for the first time in my life, the 2 people who had always seemed strong looked like they were depending entirely on me. I had no idea that the decision I was about to make would quietly change the next 12 years of my life. My father took a long breath before he finally spoke. He told me they were only asking for temporary help until they could get back on their feet. He promised the business would recover, the overdue bills would be caught up, and once everything settled down, they would pay me back little by little. My mother reached across the table, held my hand, and said they hated asking because parents were supposed to help their children, not the other way around. Hearing those words made the decision feel easy. These were the people who had worked hard to raise me. They had never asked me for anything this big before, and I couldn't imagine saying no while they were afraid of losing their home. I went home that night, looked at my savings account, and transferred enough money to bring their mortgage current. I told myself it was only for a few months. I honestly believed this difficult season would pass before the end of the year. A few months became a year. Then another year passed. Every month, right before the mortgage payment was due, my mother would call and say they were still trying to catch up. Sometimes my father would apologize, promising things were almost back to normal. I believed them because I wanted to believe them. I rearranged my own budget, worked extra shifts whenever they were available, and quietly delayed buying my own home. I never complained because I thought I was protecting my family. What confused me was Brandon. He never offered to help, at least not in any way I could see. Instead, he showed up with a newer truck, expensive watches, and stories about weekend trips with friends. Whenever I gently asked my parents if he could contribute something, even a small amount, my mother smiled and said, "Your brother is still trying to figure his life out. You know he's not as responsible as you." I nodded every time, but deep inside, a question had started growing, and before long, I would hear something that made that question impossible to ignore. About 3 years after I started making those mortgage payments, I stopped by my parents' house one Saturday without calling first. I had groceries in the back seat and planned to spend the afternoon helping my mother around the house. As I walked toward the front door, I heard voices coming from the kitchen. It was my parents and Brandon. I wasn't trying to listen, but just before I knocked, I heard my father say, "As long as Danielle keeps paying it, we don't have to worry." The room went quiet for a second, before my mother answered, "She'll never let us lose this house. That's just who she is." Then Brandon laughed and said, "Good. That gives me more time to get my own place together." I stood frozen on the porch, hoping I had misunderstood what I had just heard. I waited a few seconds, knocked on the door, and when my mother opened it, all three of them were smiling as though nothing had happened. I smiled back, but something inside me had quietly changed. For the rest of that afternoon, I couldn't stop thinking about those few sentences. They weren't talking like people who expected to repay me soon. They sounded comfortable, almost certain that I would continue carrying the mortgage, no matter how long it took. I tried to convince myself they were only speaking carelessly, but once that doubt entered my mind, I started noticing things I had ignored for years. Brandon suddenly visited my parents almost every weekend, yet he never arrived with a mortgage payment or even groceries. Instead, he talked about vacations he wanted to take and business ideas he hoped would make him rich someday. My parents listened proudly, encouraging every plan while thanking me for always being dependable. It sounded like a compliment, but each time they said it, it felt more like a job description than appreciation. I still loved my family, and I wasn't ready to believe they were taking advantage of me. Even so, I decided to pay closer attention, because for the first time, I felt like there was something important they weren't telling me. The more closely I watched, the more difficult it became to ignore what was happening. Every holiday, every birthday, and every family gathering followed the same pattern. Brandon was celebrated for the smallest accomplishments, while the things I quietly did were treated as if they were simply expected. If I paid another year's worth of mortgage payments, my parents would smile, hug me, and say they didn't know what they would do without me. Then, before the conversation could go any further, they would be telling relatives about Brandon's latest promotion that never seemed to last, or another business idea that was supposedly going to change his life. Everyone praised him for his potential. No one mentioned the daughter who was keeping the roof over everyone's head. I smiled through every family dinner because I didn't want to embarrass my parents, but every compliment they gave my brother felt like another reminder that I had become invisible inside my own family. About 6 years into this arrangement, I finally gathered the courage to ask my father a simple question. We were sitting on the back porch after dinner when I said, "Dad, have you ever thought about letting Brandon help with the mortgage? Even a little would take some pressure off me." He looked down at his coffee for a long moment before saying, "Your brother has enough on his plate. You've always been stronger than he is." It wasn't the answer I expected. I wasn't asking because I wanted praise. I was asking because I wanted fairness. Before I could respond, my mother stepped outside, heard the last part of the conversation, and quickly changed the subject. She asked Brandon to bring out dessert. And just like that, the moment disappeared. But I noticed something I hadn't seen before. My father wouldn't look me in the eyes. It lasted only a second, yet it stayed with me all the way home. That brief look made me wonder if he knew something he couldn't bring himself to say, and I was about to find out just how much had been kept from me. A year later, my father suffered a mild heart attack that changed everything. Thankfully, he survived, but the recovery was slow. Doctor appointments became weekly, medications multiplied, and my mother struggled to keep up with everything on her own. Without thinking twice, I stepped in again. I drove Dad to his appointments before work, picked up prescriptions on my lunch break, and spent weekends helping around the house. The mortgage payments never stopped, and now there were medical bills on top of them. Brandon visited once or twice during those first few weeks, but his visits were always short. He would stay long enough to ask Dad how he was feeling, hug Mom, and leave before there was any real work to do. Somehow, every relative who stopped by managed to see Brandon during one of those brief visits. They would leave saying what a devoted son he was, while I quietly washed dishes in the kitchen or organized another stack of insurance paperwork. One evening, after taking my father home from another doctor's appointment, he asked me to help him sort through a box of old documents in his bedroom. He said he wanted to make sure everything was organized, just in case anything ever happened to him. As we went through folders, he became unusually quiet. He picked up one envelope, stared at it for several seconds, then slipped it into a desk drawer instead of the box we were organizing. I noticed the movement, but I didn't ask about it. Before closing the drawer, he looked at me and said, "Danielle, you've always done more than anyone should ever expect from a daughter." I smiled and told him he didn't have to thank me because we were family. He nodded slowly, but instead of looking relieved, he looked guilty. It was an expression I had never seen on my father's face before, and although I didn't understand it then, that single moment would come back to me in the most important courtroom of my life. The years continued to pass, and before I realized it, I had been paying my parents' mortgage for 12 straight years. By then, I had stopped counting how much money I had given them because the number was too painful to think about. Friends my age were celebrating buying their second homes, planning retirement, or taking dream vacations with their families. I was still living in the same modest apartment, telling myself there would be time for my own dreams later. Every time I looked at my savings account, I reminded myself that one day my parents' home would stay in the family anyway. Even if they never repaid every dollar, I believed the house represented everything I had helped protect. It wasn't about owning it. It was about knowing that my sacrifices had meant something. That belief became the only thing that made all those years feel worthwhile. Then, within 18 months, I lost both of my parents. My father passed away first after another medical setback, and my mother never seemed to recover from the heartbreak of losing him. Sitting through 2 funerals so close together felt like living inside a fog. I wasn't thinking about money or property. I was grieving the people I had loved my entire life. A few weeks later, the attorney handling their estate invited Brandon and me to his office for the reading of the will. I walked into that room believing it would simply be a formality. Brandon was unusually relaxed, leaning back in his chair as though nothing could surprise him. I assumed he was handling his grief differently than I was. The attorney offered his condolences, opened a thick folder, and began reading the document. I listened quietly until I heard the words that made my heart stop. My parents had left the house entirely to Brandon. I waited for the attorney to continue, expecting him to mention the years I had spent paying the mortgage. Instead, he turned the page, looked directly at me, and said there was one final letter, addressed only to me. My hands were shaking as I opened the envelope. For a moment, I couldn't even read the words because my eyes kept filling with tears. I had spent 12 years believing that, no matter what happened, my parents understood what I had done for them. I wasn't expecting praise. I wasn't even expecting the house. I only wanted to know that my sacrifices had been seen and appreciated. Instead, the letter began by thanking me for always being dependable. Then it said they hoped I would understand why they had chosen to leave the family home to Brandon, because, in their words, he needs it more than you do. I read that sentence over and over, hoping I had misunderstood it. There was no mention of the mortgage payments, no promise to repay me, no explanation for why they had accepted 12 years of financial support from one child while rewarding the other with everything. It felt as though those 12 years had simply been erased. The attorney looked at me with genuine sympathy before quietly asking if I had any questions about the estate. I couldn't even answer. Brandon folded the letter back into the envelope and casually said, "Mom and Dad always worried about me more. You know that." Those words hurt almost as much as the letter itself. I stood up, thanked the attorney for his time, and walked out before anyone could see me break down. I sat in my car for nearly an hour, staring at the steering wheel, replaying every birthday I had missed because I was working overtime, every vacation I had canceled to make another mortgage payment, and every promise my parents had made that things would eventually work out. As I started the engine, one memory suddenly came rushing back. It was the afternoon my father had hidden that envelope inside his bedroom desk years earlier. For the first time, I couldn't stop wondering if whatever was inside that drawer had something to do with everything that had just happened, and I knew I wasn't ready to walk away without finding out the truth. For the next few days, I barely slept. Every conversation I had ever shared with my parents replayed in my mind, especially the ones that had never made sense at the time. The more I thought about them, the more one question refused to leave me alone. Why would my father look so guilty that afternoon in his bedroom if he truly believed leaving everything to Brandon was the right thing to do? That question became impossible to ignore. I called the attorney and asked if there were any other documents connected to the estate besides the will and the letter. He politely told me that everything he had received had already been presented. His answer should have ended my search, but instead it pushed me to trust my own memory. I drove to my parents' house for what I told myself would be one final visit. Brandon hadn't moved in yet because he was still getting the utilities transferred into his name. For a few hours, I had the house to myself, surrounded by memories that suddenly felt very different from the ones I had cherished for years. I walked into my father's bedroom and stood in front of the same desk where I had seen him hide that envelope years earlier. At first, I felt guilty opening the drawers, but I reminded myself that I had spent 12 years helping keep this house from being taken away. Slowly, I searched through old tax returns, insurance papers, church programs, and faded family photographs. Just when I was about to give up, I noticed that one drawer didn't close all the way. I reached inside the back panel and felt a small stack of papers tucked into a narrow space. My heart started racing before I even looked at them. The first page showed copies of mortgage statements. Behind them were bank records with my account number listed beside every monthly payment I had made. Then I found a signed document with my father's signature at the bottom. As I read the first few lines, I realized this wasn't just another family paper. It was something no one had mentioned during the reading of the will, and if it meant what I thought it meant, everything Brandon believed he had inherited was about to be challenged. I carefully read every page before I allowed myself to believe what I was seeing. The document wasn't complicated, but it was clear. Years earlier, after I agreed to help save the house, my father had signed a simple repayment agreement. It stated that every mortgage payment I made on their behalf would be treated as a loan to the estate if they were unable to repay me during their lifetime. The paper wasn't fancy, and it had never been filed in court, but it carried my father's signature and the signature of a family friend who had witnessed it. Attached to it was a handwritten note from my father that simply read, "Danielle should never lose what she sacrificed for us." I sat there in complete silence. For the first time since the reading of the will, I felt something other than heartbreak. I felt hope. My father hadn't forgotten me after all. Somehow, this agreement had never made it to the attorney handling the estate, and I needed to find out why. The next morning, I made copies of every document before locking the originals safely away. Then I scheduled another meeting with the attorney. When I placed the repayment agreement on his desk, his expression changed immediately. He read the pages twice before asking where I had found them. After explaining everything, he leaned back in his chair and admitted he had never seen those papers before. He also explained that if the agreement was authentic, it could completely change the financial responsibilities of the estate because my years of mortgage payments might legally be recognized as a debt that had to be settled before Brandon could receive the full value of the inheritance. My heart was pounding, but I stayed quiet. Just then, the attorney looked directly at me and said, "We're going to need to notify your brother." I already knew Brandon wasn't going to give up that house without a fight, and something told me the hardest part of this story was only just beginning. When Brandon arrived at the attorney's office a few days later, he looked as confident as he had during the reading of the will. That confidence disappeared the moment the repayment agreement was placed in front of him. He picked it up, read the first page, then quickly turned to the signature at the bottom. For the first time in years, he had no clever response. Instead, he insisted he had never seen the document before and claimed our father must have changed his mind when he later wrote the will. The attorney calmly explained that the court would have to decide whether the agreement created a legal obligation that the estate had to honor before any inheritance could be distributed. Brandon's face tightened with frustration. He looked at me and quietly said, "You're really going to take this to court?" I answered, with the only words that felt honest. "I didn't start this, I just refused to keep pretending it never happened." The weeks that followed were some of the most stressful of my life. My attorney helped me gather every bank statement, every electronic transfer, every mortgage receipt, and every email that showed exactly where the payments had come from. When we added everything together, I could hardly believe the total. 12 years of monthly payments, along with interest, represented almost everything I had sacrificed during the best years of my adult life. The evidence was impossible to ignore. Each document told the same story. While Brandon had been building his own future, I had quietly been protecting the family home. Sitting in that courtroom, I wasn't asking the judge to punish my brother or erase my parents' final wishes. I only wanted the truth to matter. As the hearing came to an end, the judge closed the file, looked down at the evidence one last time, and announced that his decision would be delivered the following week. Those 7 days felt longer than the previous 12 years, because I knew one ruling was about to decide whether my sacrifices had value or whether they would disappear forever. The courtroom was completely silent when the judge returned with his decision. I could hear my own heartbeat as everyone stood, then slowly took their seats again. The judge spent several minutes reviewing the evidence, explaining that this case was not simply about a family disagreement. It was about whether a documented financial obligation could be ignored because it happened between parents and their daughter. He pointed to the repayment agreement, the witness signature, the complete record of mortgage payments from my bank account, and the years of financial records that matched every transfer. Then he looked directly at Brandon and ruled that the estate was legally required to repay the debt before the remaining assets could be distributed. It wasn't the victory I had imagined years earlier when I first agreed to help my parents, but it was justice. The house would have to be refinanced, and part of its value used to repay everything I had contributed, along with the interest allowed under the law. For the first time since my parents passed away, I felt the weight on my shoulders begin to lift. When we walked out of the courthouse, Brandon tried to stop me in the parking lot. He said our parents would never have wanted us to end up like this. I looked at him for a moment, before quietly answering, "They had 12 years to make things right while they were alive." There wasn't anything else to say. I wasn't angry anymore. I was simply finished carrying a burden that had never belonged to me alone. About a month after everything was over, I drove past my parents' old house one last time. I hadn't planned to stop, but seeing the familiar front porch brought back memories I thought I had already buried. The flowers my mother used to care for were gone. The porch swing my father loved sat perfectly still. As I slowed down, I noticed a moving truck in the driveway. Brandon was loading boxes into the back with the help of a few friends. After the court ordered the estate to repay what I had sacrificed, he couldn't afford to keep the house. For a brief moment, our eyes met across the yard. Neither of us waved, neither of us spoke. There was nothing left to argue about. The silence said everything words never could. I kept driving, expecting to feel satisfaction after everything that had happened. Instead, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Peace. Not because I had won in court, and not because the money had finally been returned. I felt peace because I no longer needed my parents' approval to know my worth. For 12 years, I believed saving that house would keep my family together. The truth was, a family built on one person's sacrifice was already falling apart long before I ever noticed. That house was never really my dream. My dream was to be loved the way I had loved them. As I pulled into the driveway of my own home, I realized I hadn't lost my family that day in the lawyer's office. I had lost the hope that one more sacrifice would finally make them see me. And somehow, letting go of that hope became the greatest freedom I had ever known. A few months later, After the estate settled the judgment, I used the money to buy my very first home. The day I held those keys in my hand, I realized the greatest reward wasn't the house itself. It was finally choosing a life where my kindness had healthy boundaries. My parents taught me many lessons, but the one that changed my future came from the hardest chapter of all. Love should never require you to lose yourself to prove it is real. If this story touched you, let us know in the comments what you would have done if you were in my place. And if you enjoy powerful, true-to-life stories like this one, don't forget to subscribe so you never miss the next one.